This is a production of Cornell University.
So I wanted to take a minute to thank the organizations and departments that sponsored today's event. Thanks to Mann Library and to Jeff Peastrack, the wonderful Jeff Peastrack, for helping us to advertise the event. The Russell Van Nest Black Lecture Fund, Department of City and Regional Planning, the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management, the Food, Agriculture and Nutrition Group, and the New World Agriculture and Ecology Group. It's quite a diverse listing of schools and departments at Cornell, so that's very exciting. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Stephen Vogel to Cornell. Dr. Vogel earned his PhD in agricultural economics at the University of California, Berkeley, where his fields were economic development, economic history, and statistics. Dr. Vogel now serves as an agricultural economist in the farm economy branch of the Resource and Rural Economics Division at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service. It was quite a mouthful.
You don't have to say it all.
His current research program broadly investigates the farm community linkages separate from those generated by traditional commodity production. Specific topics include farmer participation in local and regional food systems, farm portfolio entrepreneurship, and small farmers' importance in the rural economy. He works to advance the collection of national farm-level survey data on the alternative uses of farm and farm household resources. Dr. Vogel, along with Dr. Sarah Lowe, published the Direct and Intermediated Marketing of Local Foods in the United States in 2011, widely cited research that is the first to show the importance of intermediated markets for getting local farm products to market, and the first to use the local foods data available within the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, the only farm-level financial data available nationally in the United States. Dr. Vogel also serves on the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food Task Force, a USDA-wide effort to carry out President Obama's commitment to strengthening local and regional food systems. Dr. Vogel plays a particularly important role on the task force and on the committee working to identify future USDA research and data needs with respect to local and regional food systems. On a more personal note, over the past few years, I have been struck more and more by the importance of what farm-level data are collected and who with what methods are available to interpret them. These decisions play a critical role in agenda setting and policy making. Dr. Vogel is one of the few economists at the USDA ERS with deep interest in farm community linkages and local and regional food systems. His research has been extremely important in my work, and I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that there is at least one Vogel reference in every paper I write. As a community who cares about relocalized food systems, we couldn't be more fortunate to have someone like Dr. Vogel at ERS. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Stephen Vogel to Cornell to present his research on understanding food systems and their prospects for economic development.
Thank you. Let me set this. I'm going to take about an hour of your time. I hope everyone can hear. This research, this presentation is part of a joint effort with Gary Madison, my co-author. We're writing a paper that pretty much is behind this. And he is vice president for young beginning small farmer programs and outreach for the Farm Credit Council. Prior to that, he was a local food systems farmer for about 20 years. This presentation is unlike anything I've ever done before in a long, long time. It's born out of a frustration in trying to develop data to quantify local food systems impacts, and I feel like I'm chasing a moving target in the sense there's so much rapid innovation, I can't do it. So in a sense, this is a conceptual paper, or presentation. The idea is that hopefully it will give you some new ideas to think about. I certainly have thought about them. So, understanding local food systems and their prospects for economic development is divided into, the task is divided into three parts. The first question I want to look at are the basics and when and where does local matter. So that's the first section. Having established the importance of local food systems, and you'll see what I mean, the next question I want to look at are what are the dynamic drivers shaping local food systems today and will continue to do so in the future. In this sense, it's basically asking the question, why am I here? Why are you here? The third question is, giving the fact that we've established dynamic drivers, that puts us in a different terrain of discussion when we're looking at dynamic linkages. We're now going to ask the final question. The third part of the talk will be farm community linkages. Can they become pivots in economic development? So let's begin with the first task. Understanding local food systems and the basics, I'd like to introduce you to the concept of retail agriculture. This is Gary Madison's presentation. I think Alan Hunt talked about it earlier, that this is basically encompasses all marketing channels through which farmers sell sustainably produced food as induced by consumers. What I want to sketch out here is what I mean by it, and here you get an idea with this figure that what's more important from this perspective is the emphasis is placed on direct marketing channels. So we see overlapping local, regional, and national marketing channels, and we see these various institutions tap into different aspects of it. Important thing to note about this is local or localism as a descriptor loses its import. It's not as important when we focus on this broader development. And to bring this home, when the Low and Vogel report was first released, I received this enthusiastic call from a farmer raising organic duck serving the Pittsburgh metropolitan area. He would supply freshly slaughtered organic duck to restaurateurs and some retail establishments. Because he had a web page, his second largest market was in Kansas City. Restaurateurs would place an order and he would guarantee freshly slaughtered duck within 48 hours to Kansas City markets. And they listed this as locally sourced. So it's important to think about that. On the other hand, local and regional food systems for us has come to mean the place-based geographic subset of retail agriculture. And we know two stylized facts from our study about this. First of all, their local food systems develop around urban markets and farmers lying in, or residing in rural areas in reasonably close proximity to urban markets. The second stylized fact that we know is that small and medium-sized farmers make up a disproportionate share of food system farmers. We view these two concepts, retail agriculture, local and regional food systems, as conceptual mirror images of each other. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm either going to refer to these interchangeably or talk about food systems or food systems agriculture. And the reason for doing this is I don't think this sector as an emerging sector there's really a name for it, and I want to sidestep debates about what is local and what isn't. But in this case, on this local regional food systems, here local is very much an important descriptor. The third part of this understanding basic concepts is that local and regional food systems have a set of shared values such that this induces producers and consumers to collaborate. These sets of shared values range from sustainably produced food, supporting economic viability of small farms in rural communities, leading up to food access and social justice concerns. And I think it's best expressed in Feenstra's article, Sustainable Agriculture and Community Development. So we have this system of shared values. Two questions that I get asked a lot after this report were, how large is food systems agriculture? And two, is it growing? So here are two basic sort of ballpark estimates using the Madison-Hunt approach. And in 2008, we calculate that there's about $7.6 billion in food system agriculture sales. And this is, I'm using a survey, I'll refer to it a lot. It's called the Agricultural Resource Management Survey. I think Becca referred to it. And so it's using that data in 2008. The second estimate, again, these are rough ballpark estimates, it's about $7.85 billion in sales. But we have an additional component, and that's $355 million in farm-to-school sales, and this was just recently released as part of the first farm-to-school census surveying school districts on whether they have programs in farm-to-school programs in their districts. There are 2 points that are important about these estimates. The first one is The value of retail agriculture is larger than the value of production of rice and cotton combined. Think about it, okay? This is not a niche sector here. This isn't small farmers selling to high-end consumers. It's not like you're studying Mercedes and saying this is the car industry. It's much broader than that. The second point here that's important is, and I work with national data collection systems, and basically they're conceptually ill-equipped to actually measure the scope of how large is retail agriculture, how large is food systems agriculture. And this is important because we need to know about impacts on the community and on rural communities, and that's sort of what drives this. So we can't find a good measure at the farm gate, and that's what I need to do. And let me give you an example. If you look at the second estimate, okay, you see the additional component farm to school sales of about $350 million. The problem is, at that same time period, we developed the first question in ARMS that asked, did the farmer have any farm to school sales? And when I looked at the data for 2011, zero, zilch. Did not get anything. And yet here, with the time period overlapping, we get $350 million. How can I measure community impacts? The problem is that the ARMS survey instrument oversamples large farms and farms in 15 core states, whereas 75% of the farm to school sales occurred in the Northeast. Those farms are vastly underrepresented in the sample, missed it. So I can't really, when I get calls on how large it is, I have difficulty. There are some problems with the 2012 census, even though it makes some improvements. The next question is it growing? So we have to rely on indirect evidence. And what we have noticed here is that since 2002, we've seen kind of a rather remarkable growth, an explosive growth in farmers markets, regional food hubs, and school districts with farm to school programs. Farmers markets have increased over twofold. Food hubs, which are business enterprises that aggregate local foods from small and medium-sized producers and then market them to larger institutions, and retail outlets have quadrupled in size, almost, and farm to school programs have increased tenfold. So we have to rely on indirect evidence. I can't cite anything close. Private sector metrics also suggest that there is rapid growth. The number one trend in both in grocer retail in 2012 and in restaurateurs is local sourcing of farm products. So the punchline here is that this is an emerging sector, and it's moving along its life cycle or its product life cycle path on the steep portion. Another way to think about it, it's moving down its very long run average cost curve. Okay, so it's in transition. There are a lot of dynamics at play, but it's here to stay. So that's the important conclusion of these two slides. Now, I briefly want to touch on research on shared values. Okay, shared values are the guiding thread, that green line in that graph, that basically keep local food systems growing, and it binds consumers, institutions, and producers and small farmers. So there's two forms of studies of shared values. They have two different perspectives on human agency. Embeddedness is a framework developed by economic sociologists, and they study market transactions, and they look backward into the social relationships that generate trust, reciprocity, and transparency. And then they further push that backwards and look at sort of the social capital that embeds these markets and allows them that fosters their development and allows them to grow. A lot of these studies predated the other type of studies. And the early studies looked at face-to-face transactions and argued that direct marketing channels produce these social bonds of trust, instill these values that became the springboard for carrying these values into retail markets. And so they were sort of the launching pad. Murdoch distinguished between social and natural embeddedness, and in this sense, the social construct related to community and the natural embeddedness related to the social relations that fostered ecological soundness and a break from current agricultural methods. Later in the literature, you began to see this term called defensive localism. And this was a recognition, and these were studies, a couple of studies actually occurred in England, that participants, that agents in local food systems were aware that what they were doing was transformative, that this was an alternative to the conventions of the industrial agricultural complex. Later studies have shifted some of the focus, and this is what's important to us, is Mount, in his article, wonders, can we preserve social embeddedness in local food systems as food systems grows and scales up? We'll address that towards the end. And then this recent study by Dabuisson-Quillet and Lemaine begin to look at, they use French case studies, and they look at participation in exchange in local foods, direct markets, and they observe how that leads to what they call consumer empowerment. So it's leading to the politically active consumer. We're all familiar with willingness to pay studies, okay? And in the early work, and this is a good lit review here, this particular article, but in early willingness to pay studies, they found very little support for distinguishing between local and organic in terms of credence cues. Credence cues are things, the reasons you buy a good that have nothing to do with the good itself. In some ways, in terms of local foods, I go to the market, I buy this good because I know it helps my farmer, the local farmer. I know the community he lives in, I'm sure he's going to retain more of the food dollar, and it's going to support the local community. That's a credence cue. Don Thilmany calls this, an altruistic behavior or public good, the public good aspects to consumer purchases. Later studies, beginning in about 2008, began to discover that there was a strong support for local versus organic in terms of representing credence attributes of locally sourced food and purchasing local sourced food. The interesting thing here is that what happens here is we're now beginning to see defensive localism emerge in studies about 3 to 4 years later in consumer demand studies and willingness to pay. Later research has found, particularly Toller here, that preferences are no longer dependent on particular market channels. That no longer is it necessary that direct marketing interactions among consumers and producers is the springboard to conforming consumer preferences. That it can occur either through retail purchases. They couldn't distinguish between the consumer who buys through retail or buys through direct marketing channels. And again, local defensive localism is very strong. And this most recent study uses economic or behavioral economics and finds it almost stronger than most. The interesting thing is, again, we're looking at this as consumer perception as being part of a transformative network. And lastly, this goes back to my duck study. Okay, this particular study finds that for some sets of consumers, localism doesn't necessarily mean distance. It's this concept that it's locally owned, it's a small enterprise, and that's more important than perhaps distance. And I think that allows some of us who feel like even though we might purchase something that is hundreds of miles away, but if it's a small farmer, I feel like I'm helping that local community. I certainly feel I'm more sympathetic to that. Okay. The reason for passing over this is we now have established that the social constructs of shared values is pervasive and broad. And I need to do that because now I'm going to switch to the second task, which is developing a framework to understand the dynamic factors. And in order to do that, I'm going to borrow 3 propositions from economic history. The first proposition, again, this is Doug North's work and Joel Malkier works on technological change. The first proposition states that institutions basically set the rules of the game. They say how the game is played. So in market functions, market transactions, sustainability here in local foods is an important part. Helping the local farmer. Those are precepts, those are informal institutional guidelines. It's all part of this thing that economists assume, on the side, leave it alone, and let's look at what we need to look at. The second proposition basically states that disruptive technological change induces technological innovation in all sectors. And this is going to be important. And then the third proposition basically states that institutional change can occur in political, social, or economic spheres when, quote, entrepreneur, and this is North's language, change agents maybe in another discipline, basically reduce the transaction costs of uncertainty in adapting to a new environment. He cites Ralph Nader, Rachel Carson as examples of entrepreneurs. So that's the framework, roughly the framework. In 1999, John Antle presented this simple supply and demand heuristic in order to look forward where agriculture is going forward and the agri-food system has been in the past. You have the traditional variables, price and quantity are endogenous, income, population growth, a vector of consumer preferences representing a heterogeneous set of consumers in the demand function, and you have input prices, capital, and technical state of affairs in the supply function. Gary and I have decided we're adding a second variable to both equations. This is our shared values function. And this is why I spent that last slide talking about shared values, is that we think these are very important as the glue that drives local food systems. And what we want to do now is that this allows us to bring to the forefront the dynamic factors that we think are important that have been shaping local food systems for 2 or 3 decades, and we'll push this envelope forward. Okay. So I'm going to spend probably the next 5-10 minutes on 2 arguments that I think are not highlighted. I think these are areas of really interesting research, at least as far as the economic historian part of me thinks so. The first one is, how do we come to understand the emergence of local foods systems as economic change? Okay, we need to figure out how this is happening. The problem working with Doug North's framework is that it's a comparative statics exercise in which we have the historical antecedent, state A, and we compare it with its consequent, state B. Okay, and then we intuit, we study the dynamics, the political economy, and we say, okay, here's how the institutional change, the technological change has occurred and how it shaped the current market. The problem with local food systems is we don't know what state B is. Okay? We can't do that exercise. We're in the midst of this incredible transformation, this period of rapid innovation, and we don't know what state B is. So we need to have a conceptual mechanism, a conceptual device that helps us understand the social dynamics and the market dynamics at play. And so here I appeal to Albert Hirschman's exit, loyalty, and voice. Okay? And it's a simple and yet complex understanding of how the world works. Exit is simple. Dissatisfied consumer leaves the market. For economists, full stop. And they go on. However, Hirschman wants to remind economists that the dissatisfied consumer can do something else. The dissatisfied consumer can complain. And if you complain in a public or a social arena, the chances are you can create coalitions. You can begin to create collective action, and hence what we're going to suggest is we begin to see the emergence of food system stakeholder groups. Let me get there. Okay. But Hirschman is awfully interested in the interaction between exit and voice. And he argues that exit and voice can lead to market transformations. He then steps back and says, okay, economists fail to account for voice in terms of market dynamics, but he then chastises social science or political scientists for saying you need to account for exit if you're going to try and understand political transformations. And so he's sitting on that knife edge. And to bring this home so that we might see how we think about it in terms of local food systems, here's a nice chart here. This chart plots against the Farm Bill years 3 variables. One is the formation when various regional and national stakeholder groups were first formed, so it represents sort of the cumulative impact and growth in stakeholder voice. That's the green line. The blue bars represent the sections in Farm Bill legislation that refer to alternative agriculture, however broadly defined. And I use a word search in this legislation when it wasn't obvious, using words from the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food compass themes. And then the third line is mandated funds authorized in the Farm Bill for expenditures related to food, alternative agriculture. The key to realize here is that I'm excluding discretionary funds, funds that either say, okay, when Congress gets around to it, or the Farm Bill legislation often sets mandated spending levels, but again, no funds. So we have this diagram. It illustrates two important points in terms of the exercise of voice. The first one is that institutional change is slow. Okay, the second wave of co-ops generated a new interest in organic farming and began to spread interest. In 1980, though, the USDA released its first white paper on organic farming. And it was related saying this is an important sector, we should commit resources to understanding and improving organic farming. And the interesting thing about it, according to one historian, is that it represents the first time that organic farming got street cred in national policy circles. So there's a point there. In 1990, the Organic Certification Act, part of the 1990 Farm Bill, 23 of the 27 sectors in that Farm Bill relate to the authorization of the process creating organic certification. The interesting thing, no funds were provided. Okay, so part of the time when you read these farm bills, you want to know whether this is window dressing or whether Congress is actually mandating this. And it took more exercise of voice, and then 4 years later, there was a congressional authorization to begin the process. Finally, we moved to 2002, and we have the establishment of organic certification standards. It took over 20 years, to go from this small level of stakeholder voice to 2002, and the organic certification standards. The second point that I want to make here is prior to 2008, most Farm Bill legislation paid little attention to the concerns of alternative agriculture or authorized very little funding. Now, there are other acts, but I don't want to get into those. And so you can see the formation of certain stakeholder groups over time. But the point about the Farm Bill of 2008 is that it represents a watershed of legislation. It is the first Farm Bill in which all titles, all 30 sections of the Farm Bill legislation had something that dealt with directly or indirectly facilitating and supporting food systems, alternative agriculture. So in a sense, you're reaching this, what this comes to symbolize is you're reaching a viability threshold, or what an older economic historian might say, a takeoff stage of food systems agriculture. It is no longer a question, and I know I'm speaking to most of you who might subscribe to this, it's no longer a question that economic viability of food systems agriculture. That's not the question. The question is how does it develop as it moves forward? Okay. Now, the next dynamic driver is what I call innovations in information and communications technology. Okay. In the 1990s, and I call this period Internet 1.0, you had the internet highways being laid down, the knowledge warehouses being developed, B2B transformation. And John Antle, in his presidential address, argued that this gave consumers unheard of access to information on production, sustainability methods, and it allowed them to shape demand. And that they would be in the driver's seat in the foreseeable future in terms of shaping the agri-food system. He, however, also thought that the Internet 1.0 would improve efficiencies of the existing economies of scale, primarily through B2B development. But the interesting thing is he's sharing a common belief even among economic geographers and among people who are concerned about technological diffusion. So what has changed since Internet 1.0? Okay, well, a lot. We have big data, we have ubiquity of high-speed internet, we have new communication platforms, social media, Dropbox, we have new technical electronic devices that we've never had before. And as a consequence, we're in a different world. And so I'm going to argue that, and again, this is reading the tea leaves, not necessarily knowing how to cook the tea in terms of research or brewing the tea, but I'm going to argue that Internet 2.0 has facilitated or catalyzed local food systems growth in 3 ways. The first way, boom, is that ICT, Internet 2.0, has weakened the economies of scale in the food supply chain. And there's some evidence, I'm going to show you some examples, but basically what it is even if you have concentration in retail grocer industry, at the bottom end, at the bottom level, ICT is creating opportunities for small and medium-sized farmers. And there's a paper by Ashok Mishra and others, and I forget the name of the paper, but it actually uses ARMS data to show that small farmers who work with the internet sell more locally and reduce their inputs, particularly their crop farmers on chemicals. The 2 examples I want to talk about are National Market Maker and Organic Valley. National Market Maker, as it is now known, originally started in 2004 as a web portal that would match local farmers producing organic and sustainably produced food with local markets. So it was an information communication platform that allowed consumers and producers to hook up. It now has portals for 20 states. So again, this is in the virtual world. Organic Valley is a dairy cooperative with about $700 million in sales in 2012. It is a virtual enterprise in which it basically links horizontally 43 milk pools, regional milk pools across the US. And in its commitment to local community development or local community viability, it basically arranges contracts between local organic dairy producers, processors, and truckers. So in a sense, it's sort of a horizontal way of linking things together and preserving the local dimension of things. The second way in which Internet 2.0 has facilitated the expansion of food systems agriculture is that it's reduced the transaction costs of organization. It has allowed for the amplification of voice. The Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food Compass was launched in, I think, a couple years ago. It's gone through several iterations. It's a map, interactive map. It has several database overlays. And it's basically, according to Secretary Merrigan, was designed to foster, amplify a, quote, national conversation about where your food comes from. The other citation is interesting because it's an MBER paper, and it actually shows, its purpose was to demonstrate how ICT contributed to the expansion of voice. What it did that's interesting, though, it took the 5-star movement, which was largely mobilized in Italy through social media. It followed the expansion of broadband and then looked at victories in municipal elections, ultimately leading to the defeat of Silvio Berlusconi as PM in Italy. So again, research can be done in this area. It's just I don't know what the metrics would be. Okay, the third way in which ICT will continue, and this will be a more important role in the future, is it will foster the diffusion of tacit knowledge through virtual or hybrid innovation communities. This is really important. Most of the research done or the change of the millennia focused on the characteristics and the attributes of place-based industrial clusters. And when they looked at ICT and they looked at the importance of innovation in these clusters, they argued that you needed a strong social capital among interdependent firms and researchers so that you could trade ideas. You could begin to generate tacit knowledge, which is learning by doing. It's knowledge that's not yet codified. You're still working things out, but you're creating this communication and you're creating these knowledge spillovers that evolve into the new ways of doing things. The problem with local food systems is they're inherently small, that you inherently do not have the kind of concentration of industries, of research sites that you can actually organically in one spatial location create the innovation. And one of the things that I've been impressed with is that a cluster in itself, an innovation cluster, industrial clusters are basically sources of learning how to do new stuff. They surface geographically in various places, but we're moving into the 21st century, and we have to look at things differently. And I've been at the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food task force and talking with various individuals. I'm amazed at the unanticipated interconnectedness between farmers, food chain consumers, and I'm not talking about the consumer, but retail and institutional consumers, and institutions. Institutions are becoming a very important player, but we have webinars, certain local food hubs will post sites on how to do things better, and this is something that's evolving. Remember, this is an emerging sector, and we don't know the outcome, but we need to be aware of it, and we need to be aware of the role of Internet 2.0 as it changes things. Okay, the third dynamic driver is much more familiar to us, and that is the twin concepts of social entrepreneurship and shared value creation. A social entrepreneur basically operates a business enterprise in order to address societal ills. Two characteristics of social entrepreneurship distinguish it from philanthropy, and that is, one, it can either be a for-profit firm with a mission-driven strategy or a nonprofit with an income-earning strategy. And then the second part of social entrepreneurship is that embedded in its business plan is innovation and mission diversification. Okay, so it's not sitting still. Its existence is not predicated upon providing a service. The classic example that I know of, and again, social entrepreneurship is found in the business schools, there's programs in it, but not in Ag Econ. But the classic example is DC Kitchens, DC Central Kitchen. In 1989, it started as an organization to provide meals to nutritionally at-risk households in poor areas in Washington, D.C. What does it do today? Well, it's expanded. It runs a food hub with links to Amish farmers in the Shenandoah Valley. It has a gleaner program. It has a program it has a culinary school for the unemployed. It's beginning to operate some food-to-school market provisions, and it's just started a produce delivery service to corner stores in urban food deserts, and really the poor part of DC where they don't have access to supermarkets. Moreover, it recently has decided that it can replicate this business model, and it started a national program where it's willing to train college students and university students on how to generate their own program in supplying nutritious food, nutritious meals to underserved populations through gleaning of their own institutional food service. Shared value creation. This is a very ambitious argument proffered by Kramer, or Porter and Kramer. They go so far to say that in order to ensure economic progress in the future, companies and corporations must recommit resources to solving societal ills. They furthermore make the claim that in the process of doing so, they will create new sources of profit. They will create new sources of innovation that will represent new economic value for themselves while contributing social value to the local community. They do it through introducing new products or through reconfiguring their supply chain such that productivity can generate local clusters development. Or they introduce it by reducing costs by mandating such things as healthy living among their workforce, where I forget the firm they cited that saved hundreds of millions of dollars doing so. The example I want to use is the one that they use. It's Walmart, a very controversial example. Walmart in 2010 announced that it was going to try and locally source 10% of their fresh food. In 2013 at the Ag Outlook conference, the Walmart executive basically presented slides in which Walmart was devoting resources to developing its own sustainability indices, building programs and teaching methods for teaching farmers how to grow sustainable, small and medium-sized farmers for growing sustainably produced goods, and well as reconfiguring its distribution network to increase food access to underserved areas. This is a contentious example, but there's not as much research as there are magazine rants that actually question whether this is effective or not, but they're part of the conversation. Remember, local food systems development is still a contested terrain. Stakeholders are still working things out. It's a state of industrious cacophony at this point in time. But Walmart is an important example just to highlight. Okay, the final dynamic driver are what I call the influence of extra market organizations. Okay, and I'm just going to focus on one because, to be honest with you, Gary and I sat over lunch and said, this is important, and then he relayed a couple others, but I don't have time to talk about them. But the ones I want to, the non-market motivations that drive public discourse that come most immediate to mind is that of the medical profession, the medical community. Okay, a number of articles dating years and research have long held responsible the industrial food supply system for contributing to obesity, diabetes, heart issues, and other public health menace that generate incredible social cost. The most recent article here in Lancet, the two articles, really begin to talk about the global food system contributing to the obesogenic environment that communities live under. And I like that word, the obesogenic environment. Okay, but the example I want to use is this organization, this consortium that started in 2005. It's the Healthy Food and Healthcare Initiative. And the interesting thing about it, it's a consortium of 53 hospital systems that work with individual members to adapt their food supply structure internally inside the hospital so that they can process and take in more healthy, locally produced foods. The interesting thing about this is Kaiser Permanente in California have been doing things like this that predated the 2005 day of when this was formed through establishing farmers markets on their grounds and beginning to develop food hubs. Okay, how has the public sector responded? Okay, I'm going to argue here that, of course, at the federal level, in 2008, the Farm Bill was watershed legislation. The 2014 Farm Bill reauthorizes a lot of the programs of embedded in the 2008 legislation, and also it amplifies or it extends the scope of some programs and it increases funding of others. But on the other hand, in 2009, with the establishment of the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food Task Force here, internally, what we were responsible for is looking at programs inside each agency and sort of removing their organizational silos. It's a coordination function. We have no additional funding authority, but we can look within existing legislation that existed prior, perhaps develop a project, but we can also coordinate program effectiveness through interagency cooperation. An example of this is last year, this time, the Farm Service Administration just developed its micro-lending program in which it would lend up to $35,000 to a producer, a small producer that doesn't have a production history that would allow them to qualify for conventional business loans. We know that USDA funding has accounted for about $330 million in a fiscally austere climate in terms of funding food system projects. About 50% of them are in infrastructure. Another 25% are in healthy food access and beginning farmer. The Know Your Food Compass has 8 themes and they're spread across it, but those are the main ones. The interesting thing is that there's also federal buy-in among other departments. It's not just agriculture. Okay, the largest investor in food hub projects is transportation. Okay, but CDC is interested, Health, Food, and Human Service, or HHS, is interested. The interesting thing about this Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food task force and initiative is here's an interesting topic for public policy thesis. It's becoming a model of how to coordinate policy. There is now what's called the Strikeforce initiative, which is in USDA. It's assembling a task force that integrates, removes the program silos to target persistent poverty regions in the United States in terms of rural development, farming. Local food systems is a part of it. There's some overlapping interest. This idea of a strike force, of a coordinating task force, is now part of President Obama's Promise initiative, which looks at community development in both urban and rural areas. So we're talking about a new style of governance here. Okay, and of course, you folks are aware of state-level things. This is Illinois, you're aware of that. Louisiana just recently passed a law in which restaurateurs would receive a 4% cash rebate on purchases of locally sourced food. And just recently, the Virginia First Lady, the incoming Virginia First Lady, announced that the Local Foods Initiative was going to be her project in which she would want to promote food access linked to local community development. The interesting thing about here is that the Northeast, every time I give this talk, I say the Northeast is at the frontier. There's so much exciting development going on here that I can't be possibly aware of all of it. And I think you folks are at the forefront. There's a lot to be studied and learned. So we've established this. Now we're going to move to part 3, which is now having established these dynamic factors are at play, are strong, and will continue to push the envelope. We're now going to look at the impact or prospects for economic development. Okay, economic development process is transformative. It goes beyond just economic growth. It goes beyond just changing in economic markets. It changes society as a whole. And to get this point across and to get what I'm getting at, here's a simple fractal image. But it's going to make a very simple message. And what it's going to do is what you see in this fractal image is you see the churn of the development process occurring at all levels: local, regional, and national. The incentives in human agency occur at all levels. The only thing that's different is, depending on the scale and geography, we create different concepts. We have different vocabulary for studying it. So for example, if we're talking about regional development, we might think that it's important to study regional cluster formation and look at regional spillovers. On the other hand, when we look at local levels, I'm going to argue that if we are to see local economic growth induced by food systems agriculture, clearly economic development, it's going to be felt at the local level. So this is where we ought to be able to see things. Okay. Now, so I want to look at 3 types of farm community linkages. I want to look at structural linkages, flow linkages, and dynamic linkages, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, structural linkages here are basically the link is local food systems being able to alter the structural pathways of food system of flows in a local economy. And here, I'm going to look at the multiplier studies. And one of the things, I've done multiplier works for a long time, but one of the things that's important to Jablonski and Schmidt is they're actually going through survey data, figuring out how the structural matrix itself changed. That's what structural transformation is. It's not running some new multiplier experiment and saying this happens. It's actually adjusting the structural matrix. And when I asked my professor in grad school, when we were looking at economic development in the developing world, I said, how do you get at structural change? And he said it was awfully difficult. So that represents an important study. It finds that local food systems farmers generate larger output, employment, and value-added multipliers. Another study that I can't cite yet because it's still in its formative stage, but they gave a presentation at the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food Task Force in a different region, finds that output and labor or employment multipliers are less than traditional farming, but value-added multipliers are more. These 2 studies begin to confirm that the food dollar is retained more with the local food system farming than conventional agriculture. And this is important because this leads into flow linkages. Okay, flow linkages are a little different way, and I've just started thinking about them. These are basically additional flows generated by $1 million in gross farm sales. Okay, so we have what I call direct linkages, and that is food system farmers collectively spend $177,000 more on farm inputs per $1 million in gross sales than the non-participating farmers. Okay? But what's more important are indirect linkages. And this is where my debt to Cornell comes into play. And I forgot to do this at the beginning of the lecture, but Cornell, with John Miller's work and Eric Thorbeck, have had a tradition of looking at household linkages and arguing that in agricultural development, the indirect linkages of household consumption spending is larger. And so I'd like to give a special shout out to Eric right now. But this is important, and what we find with respect to local food system farmers is that farm households collectively spend on average $217,000 more per $1 million in gross farm sales than non-participating farmers. So in this concept of flow linkages, it's not just $1 million in gross farm sales by local food system farmers that goes through the system. It's the additional almost $400,000 per $1 million in sales that also becomes a shock. And this is a stylized fact right now. To evaluate whether this actually occurs on the ground, there's several analytical steps that one must proceed. And we don't have the data to do it yet. So now lastly, I turn to dynamic linkages. Okay, dynamic linkages are going to facilitate virtuous cycles in food system clusters. That's their objective. Roughly the way a virtuous cycle occurs is if you can imagine a catchment area in which the center of this catchment area is a urban market surrounded by farmers and rural communities in proximity to this urban market. You induce, either through infrastructure investment or some infrastructure investment, it reduces transactions and marketing costs so that it expands demand. Farmers are willing to produce more because it's cheaper, it's easier to get to market, and so they become more productive. But at the same time, it enlarges the catchment area because it brings farmers residing further out from the urban complex into the food system, and in a local food system. And in this case, you have an expansion and you have growth. Okay. When you have economic growth, you create bottlenecks, obstacles, institutional problems. And to the extent that the food systems that farmers, producers, institutional buyers, institutional organizations can innovate and develop and surmount and overcome these obstacles, that's the virtuous cycle. And it can continue so long as food demand increases. So this is what we have to observe. Okay, the first thing we have to observe is that institutional and social enterprise collaboration in market channel development. And the example I use here is Gunderson Lutheran Healthcare System and the Fifth Season Cooperative. In Wisconsin, the Gunderson Lutheran Healthcare System wanted to start bringing in local foods in their food service project. So one of the board members actually helped start Fifth Season Cooperative. It's comprised of food chain customers, mostly retail, institutions, and farmers. Not us, not consumers. And they're cooperative. In order to join as a farmer, you have to produce according to certain sustainability standards. And as other members, you have to develop your marketing channel in your own enterprise. This is important collaboration. The second thing that we have to look at is that we need to observe, and we are observing, virtual and hybrid enterprises providing aggregation, technological services, and outreach to stakeholders. And the two examples I use here are Local Harvest and Food Hub. Food Hub is a virtual food hub that serves 4 to 5 states on the West Coast. It's a virtual entity, but it does the coordination task in terms of reaching institutional buyers and retail buyers and producers. Local Harvest I know more about. It originally started as a national registry of community-supported agricultural arrangements, but has expanded since then. It now has a business spin-off that developed software for community service or community-supported agricultural arrangements and food hubs. Moreover, it now runs a web-based, a virtual storefront, in which case, if some high-end customer wants some really obscure, organically produced commodity that they can't find in their region, they go here, they'll find the closest producer and ship it to you. But it's diversified, it's expanded, it's growing as the sector is growing. This third important thing about dynamic linkages. I think this is something that we have to sort of describe in the future in terms of research. Stakeholders, in order to grow and prosper, are going to need to create their own innovation clusters. And given that local food systems are too small to support in most cases, it may not be true in the Northeast. Some sociologists or economists may be able to document the forming of a food system cluster within the Northeast. But we're going to need virtual innovation clusters. We're going to need ways of creating new knowledge and transmitting that new knowledge to basically small organizations that are separated by distance. So the question I have next to pose, and we'll wrap it up here, is can food hubs become these dynamic actors? So here's two questions that need answering. First, the first question says, are food hubs, can they be the interstitial glue that preserves social values? This goes back to Mount's concern, in which he actually thought food hubs might be able to play a part here, but he was concerned that you preserve the transformative set of social values that shape market transactions in local food hubs. The second point just simply says, can they innovate? So rather than trying to go through verbiage and talk about that, let me just put this figure up. This is local food hub in Charlottesville, Virginia. They're a young food hub. Their primary function is serving as a distribution warehouse, but they have offered all these other services. They offer farm services, producer planning services. One of the things that came out of a review of the Hudson Valley Food Hub project was the need to educate farmers, especially young beginning farmers, on you're running an enterprise. Most small businesses fail. A lot of small farms fail. So you have to learn, you have to learn your craft. So they developed these farm services. They also have an educational farm to bring people in, and they do community services. This is kind of the multi-mission portfolio that food hubs can play. And often their inputs come from downstream and upstream to help shape the direction of the local food system. So that's the presentation. So in conclusion, the central question is can food hub systems agriculture or food systems agriculture be a source of economic development? And my answer is it's too early to tell. But I think the pieces are being put in place. This is what we observe. We observe that food system agriculture is transforming a fairly sizable sector of US farm to fork. We know that the dynamic factors will continue to push the innovation envelope, and we'll see more institutions becoming on board, particularly in social and state and federal policy. The other thing is, I think I can state, at least as a stylized fact, that food system farmers generate larger local linkages. And that's both structural and flow. So research and data needs. We need more of it everywhere. We need all aspects of local food systems, local and regional food systems across all social science disciplines. I've been starting to read master's theses because they're the first ones actually to address the case for and against federal funding of food hubs. And I saw that as an Oregon State master's thesis. Okay, we need all of it. When we get down to the farm gate level, though, and this is a personal pet peeve here, is I think more emphasis on research in my profession need to focus on the farm family business. As a family business, I did some work on multi-enterprising farmers where you look at entrepreneurship as the central focus. Farmers are willing to market healthy produced foods wherever they can find it. They will be part of creating new mechanisms. But this is different than what conventional agricultural economics does, which focuses more on the family farm business, and it focuses on production. And I think we need to look more towards the small business school or the business school literature on small businesses and see if we can borrow some insights that they have to offer. And that, my friends, is it. Boom.
This has been a production of Cornell University. On the web at cornell.edu.